COVID variant, the strain helping to push daily average cases to levels that were once unthinkable, currently above the 400,000 mark. Joining us right now is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's the former FDA Commissioner and a CNBC contributor who also serves on the boards of both Pfizer and Illumina. And Scott, I've been looking forward to this conversation all morning because I've got a lot of questions for you. I think first up, we keep hearing about hospitalizations with COVID being up, and I know that that is the big concern. If the hospitals get overrun, we have a problem. But are the hospital numbers up because people are hospitalized because of COVID, or are the hospital numbers up because people are hospitalized for other things and happen to test positive with COVID because it's so rampant in the general population right now? What's the answer?
Yeah, we don't have good data in the United States on how many people are being hospitalized and they're incidentally picking up COVID. They have COVID but don't know it. They're coming in for other reasons, or they get COVID in the hospital. Generally speaking, when you look at the data across the world from prior variants, prior waves, about 20% of the hospitalizations were incidental, meaning that about 20% of hospitalizations that were recorded as COVID hospitalizations actually were hospitalizations for another cause, but the patient was found to have COVID and was admitted as a COVID admission. I would suspect that it's higher during this wave, just given how pervasive this infection is, but I wouldn't expect it to be appreciably higher. So maybe it's 30% of admissions are people who are being admitted for other reasons, but have found to have COVID on admission. I wouldn't expect it to be higher than that, though.
Is this a situation where hospitals are being overrun because of COVID cases and having to cancel other procedures or not being able to treat other people or not having enough beds? I mean, maybe that's the critical question in how we deal with all of this.
Yeah, look, we're seeing a very clear decoupling between hospitalizations and cases. It's now well established that this is less virulent. It's causing less severe disease on the whole in most people, with the exception perhaps of toddlers who are more susceptible to an upper airway disease like this. This does seem to bind more in the upper airway than the lower airway, but there's a clear decoupling between hospitalizations and cases. That said, if you have enough cases, you're going to end up having a lot of hospitalizations, and you also have to worry a lot about regions of the country that were having pretty big Delta waves heading into this, so they were late to have their Delta surge and also having big outbreaks of flu. And that would describe the Northeast, it would describe New York City, it would describe the Mid-Atlantic region as well. Remember, before Omicron struck, we had 60,000 people hospitalized in this country. Now we have Omicron on top of that. And Omicron hasn't completely crowded out Delta. About 30% of the admissions in Baltimore are actually Delta admissions, even still. So Delta's still hanging around in parts of the country where it's becoming epidemic. But you are seeing a very clear decoupling. So, for example, in New York City, they're running at about 45% of the hospitalizations that they saw in the spring of 2020 during that very big peak wave, that initial wave. They're running at about 15% of the ICU admissions. So they're substantially lower than what they were during that extreme peak. Now, that extreme peak really brought the system on the brink of collapse. So being at 45% of those hospitalizations is still a lot. And remember, you're against a healthcare system that's pressed also by the fact that there are staffing shortages. You can't move personnel around the country like you were able to do during that first wave. And they're seeing a rising incidence of flu admissions on top of it.
So then you get to today being the first day back to school and a lot of anxious parents trying to figure out what this is going to mean when we have seen the cases skyrocket, at least around us. Our school is not offering a virtual option. They made us feel better yesterday by saying, don't worry, any day that it's above 32 degrees, we're going to let the kids eat outside, until I looked at the weather and saw every day this week it's 20 degrees. They actually said, one of my kids' schools said, we would appreciate it if students would wear masks at all times, including in between bites, which is about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Maybe we can ask them to stop breathing in the buildings, too. There's so much confusion and so much unknown about what to do at this point. What do you tell people? What do you tell schools? What do you tell parents?
Yeah, look, the first thing I'd say is that, and we've said this before, so I appreciate there's diminished credibility, but this is not going to last very long. We're going to be in the throes of this wave of infection for maybe a month. Here in the Northeast, I think you're going to see infections peak out within the next 2 weeks. So hopefully New York City does find a peak within the next 2 weeks. London, which is about 2 to 3 weeks behind New York City, has already peaked and is probably on the way down. So this is a very fast-moving wave of infection. On the back end of this, hopefully we're done with COVID for a while. We'll have enough immunity in the population between vaccination or infections. So we really need to get through this month. I think in terms of the schools, the prerogative very clearly needs to be to try to open the schools. I think if you keep the kids in very strict pods, social pods, you can control the risk that there's going to be outbreaks in that setting. And that's really the goal. you're not going to be able to avoid introductions into that setting. There will be infections introduced into the schoolhouse setting in such a dense wave like we're having right now. But you want to avoid outbreaks in the school. And I think you could do that keeping kids in strict social pods. That's probably the single best intervention. The other one would be routine testing. And even now, and it's frustrating, schools still don't have access to routine testing and using test-to-stay strategies in the schoolhouse.
Okay, so let's assume your school doesn't do any testing, doesn't require any testing, doesn't have it available, and isn't really isolating in pods. You know, you've still got classrooms there, and they're 3 feet apart instead of 6 feet apart. They're going to be eating inside and masking up in between bites, which just, again, is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. What do you do for the next month? You just send your kid and wish for the best?
Well, I think that's the position a lot of parents are in, quite frankly. I think you could test your child at home, try to avoid introducing the infection back into the home. The children are at lower risk overall, except for young toddlers, who I think face higher risk with an upper respiratory infection like the one we're dealing with in this Omicron. But schools can try to keep kids separated. We're talking about a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks here in the Northeast, that this is really going to be epidemic. Schools are reopening, you know, right in the throes of the peak of this epidemic wave here in the Northeast. I think you can keep kids in strict social pods for a short duration of time if you know it's going to be a short duration of time. It is somewhat disruptive to do that, but it's possible, depending on the physical plan of the school. And this epidemic probably is going to pass through the country over the course of the next month. By February, by some point in February, most parts of the country will be through it. Not every part of the country has been touched by it yet. The Mid-Atlantic region and Northeast are having very dense waves. Florida is, parts of the Pacific Northwest. Other parts will lag, but this will move very quickly. From peak to peak in other countries, Omicron swept through in less than 2 months.
Hey, Scott, Happy New Year. 2 questions, one very practical and the other is sort of a larger policy question. The practical question is that we just had the CEO of Planet Fitness on, and he said that people are coming to gyms. He encourages them to come to gyms. He thinks that's the best way for them to stay healthy. Would you go to an indoor gym in an environment where Omicron or COVID period right now is ramping up?
Look, I think a lot of people have been taking precautions for 2 years and are frustrated and tired. And so you're seeing people throw in the towel. I don't think this is the time to let up your vigilance if you've been careful in trying to avoid this infection for legitimate reasons to date, because we really hopefully have just a month of this very dense epidemic wave. This infection is everywhere. This is widespread. I think we're picking up a fraction of the cases that are occurring. I wouldn't be surprised if we're only picking up close to 1 in 10 infections. So this is an epidemic that's being driven by people who have mild infection or asymptomatic infection, don't suspect they're infected, and are going about their business. So I wouldn't be going out right now. I'd be careful the next 2 or 3 weeks. I think this is going to be a short-lived, very fast epidemic here in the Northeast, and we're going to be on the back end of this. We're going to be starting to get on the back end of this in a couple of weeks.
Okay, so then the big policy question is, should we be investing more in testing long-term? If this is going to plow through the country as quickly as you say it may, depending on what you think is going to be on the other side of this, you could end up with billions of tests if we ever manufactured that many tests that are not being used? Or do you say it's worth that investment? Is there investment to be made in N95 and K95 and other masking? Is there investments worth being made in things like ventilation inside buildings and the like long term? Or do you say to yourself, we're getting through this, and on the other side, we're not going to need those things?
Yeah, look, I think we need to do that. I think we need to stockpile these things. We should have been doing that before. And one of the reasons we haven't stockpiled the rapid antigen tests is that they have expiration dates that are very short dated, probably because they haven't done the long-term stability studies with the reagents in those tests to demonstrate that they can have a long shelf life. But they can have a long shelf life. I think that they were probably sped to the market, so they didn't invest in the time to do those stability studies. So they have short expiration dates. That prevents hospitals and municipalities from stockpiling them. I was looking at this before the show. I didn't set this up. So this is a Lucira test. The date on this test it expires November in this year. This is the BD Veritor test. The date on this test, it expires May of this year. And this is the popular Binax, and this test expires, and these are all just bought. I just bought these. It expires October this year. So these don't even last a year. Some of them only last 6 months when you first buy them. That prevents consumers, it prevents governments, hospitals from stockpiling these tests. So the first thing we need to do from a regulatory standpoint is do the long-term stability studies to demonstrate that these can stay on the shelf for a long period of time. The Kydell test, actually, I bought one of those as well. That has a 2-year expiration date, so very clearly they did the long-term stability studies. But we should be investing in that shelf life extension for these tests and in trying to stockpile these for what is an inevitable surge of infection probably next fall. This is going to become a seasonal virus. Hopefully on the back end of this Omicron wave, prevalence comes way down. We have that quiet spring and summer that we expected last year, barring some new variant. We're going to have a lot of immunity in the population. But coming back next fall, we're probably going to be challenged by this again. We're going to have to revaccinate. We'll have to, look towards masks and tests for people who are vulnerable. Certainly not the kind of wave of infection we're seeing right now, but this is something that's becoming much more flu-like. Even this current Omicron wave, in many respects, is flu-like. But when you infect this many people, even if the case fatality rate is more of a flu-like 0.1%, still a lot of people are going to end up dying from this and being hospitalized.
Look, if this is the case, if this is becoming much more flu-like, when does this just become endemic instead of pandemic? We don't shut things down for the flu.
Yeah, I mean, technically the flu is a pandemic every year, but we have tools to deal with it. I think really next fall, I think this is the transition year where we're going from this pandemic phase to an endemic phase. Omicron was an unexpected divergent form of evolution of this virus. But on the back end of this, there's going to be so much immunity in the population. People will have had this twice, will be vaccinated. But I think on the back end of this, there's going to be enough of a wall of immunity that this isn't going to spread the same way again. We're also going to have widely available oral drugs that could be taken to help mitigate the risk of infection. Those will be in, abundant supply as we head into the summer. They'll be stockpiled heading into next fall. So I think we'll have a much different toolbox. We'll have much more immunity in the population, and this will be the year this becomes more of an endemic virus and settles into a seasonal pattern. We're just not in it right now. Hopefully on the back end of this starts to settle into more of a seasonal pattern and becomes a winter pathogen like most respiratory pathogens are.
Dr. Gottlieb, thank you. Great to see you this morning.
Thanks a lot.